into the shocking school massacre in Texas and the same old bloody circus. An 18-year-old boy celebrated his birthday by buying guns, including, he said, a couple of AR-15 semi-automatics. He then went to his former primary school in a small town in Texas and shot dead 19 children, as well as their teacher, before police finally shot him dead. The parents of that school were beside themselves with fear for their children. And now again we're getting, as we always do with these American shootings, heartfelt appeals for more action to control guns. And sitting here in Australia, you're wondering why this even needs saying.
As a nation, we have to ask, when in God's name are we going to stand up to the gun lobby? When in God's name we do what we all know in our gut needs to be done? The idea that an 18-year-old kid can walk into a gun store and buy 2 assault weapons is just wrong.
I'm here on this floor to beg, to literally get down on my hands and knees and beg my colleagues. Find a path forward here. Work with us to find a way to pass laws that make this less likely.
But America is different, and I'm not sure how much will change. For a start, with twice as many of these shootings than 2 years ago, with 30% more murders in just 1 year, would you want to give up your guns, or would you want to make sure you are armed as well? And then there's America's gun culture. 1 in 3 Texans have a gun. The state's governor once said he was embarrassed that Texas was second to California in buying new guns. Pick up the pace, Texans, he said. And last year he boasted he'd signed new laws to let people carry a handgun with no license, no training. Joining me from Washington is Adam Creighton, US correspondent for the Australian newspaper, and from Melbourne, Koshigada, a US-born commentator and tech entrepreneur. Adam, America's had so many gun massacres. Even the school shooting is only the 3rd worst in its history. So is the reaction to this massacre any different?
Well, look, I don't think it is, Andrew. I think it's the same sort of grief, the same sort of shock that we see all the time. And sadly, these tragic events are becoming more common. I mean, this is the 202nd kind of mass shooting this year in the US, which is defined as the shooting of 4 or more people. And those shootings have increased rapidly. In 2019, there were about 400, and then in 2020, there were about 600, and then last year, 700. So this is a grisly trend, very depressing. So on the political front, though, it might mean that there's a greater likelihood of some sort of change in terms of background checks, in terms of the age of people who can buy guns. Because as you suggested in your editorial, it is just extraordinary in this country how such young people, they can't drink alcohol, but on their 18th birthday, they can go and buy firearms and cause this extraordinary tragedy and grief.
Kosha, look, to many Australians, America's gun culture is a complete mystery. Explain it to us.
Hi, Andrew. Good evening to you. And this is obviously just such a sad, sickening day, and my heart goes out to the parents, especially of these 19, 7, 8, and 9-year-olds tonight who are going through unimaginable pain that no parent should have to go through, let alone those sending their kids to school in the United States of America. And to answer your question about how to think about gun culture, I would summarize it really in this way. That there's not a single American who does not want to prevent these types of events, and the gun violence issue is a real issue in America. Where the divergence comes in is in the solution and what we think the root cause analysis of it is. So there's one camp of the country really that does think that the proliferation and access to guns by civilians in the U.S. is the issue. There's something like 400 million guns in circulation. You curtail that and the violence will come down. However, there's the other side of the aisle that believes you cannot legislate against evil, and that is an incorrect root cause analysis because in most of these cases, the perpetrator who has the gun often procures it illegally. So the issue is not legislation, but the issue is enforcement and the decriminalization of people, people who should be behind bars being set out easily. There's a mental health epidemic. So this shooter, as well as others in schools, it always tends to be a 17, 18-year-old mentally unstable person. He shot and killed his grandmother before he drove to the school. So what's driving that? And there are other tactical measures you could have, such as really boosting the security that's in schools. There's a paradox where some of the most violently gun-ridden places like Chicago and Baltimore, et cetera, actually don't have school shootings because their schools have massive security measures akin to an airport, which is sad, but it works. So there's many aspects to it, and I think what drives it is this is a Second Amendment. It is revered by people, and in order to change it, there is a process to come up with a constitutional amendment, and there just is not universal acceptance on what the root cause is, and therefore what the solution should be.
Well, it's interesting. On one point you made, I saw a research that said no school where teachers are allowed to carry guns has ever had a school shooting in the hours between 6 and midnight. I don't know why that proviso. I saw a study of that. It's this school, you were not allowed to carry a gun in school, except no one told the gunman, I guess. Adam, what did you make of that? You're looking at the gun, you're an Australian in America. What do you make of the gun culture?
Mm-hmm. Well, look, it's globally unusual. I mean, I read yesterday, I think it's only the USA and Mexico of large countries that enshrine these gun-carrying rights, and it leads, at least in my view, to extraordinary increase in murders and homicides and mass shootings. Of course, every country has its quotient of crazy people, of deranged lunatics who would commit these crimes. But in the US, the mass shooting rate is in magnitudes greater than in other countries, and I think the only thing that explains that, I think, is the availability of these sorts of firearms and the 400 million guns that are in the US. I mean, 40% of households in the US have access to a gun in their house. I mean, that is an extraordinary figure by Australian standards. On the other hand, I can understand the history of the US and the desire to have this Second Amendment right to wean off, to protect communities against any sort of government intrusion in the future. I think that's a valid concern, but I don't think that they've struck a reasonable balance between these rights when you have teenagers who can buy, semi-automatic weapons. So I think there needs to be a lot of improvement.
I know. Yeah, but the thing is, Coach, when I hear about something like this, say you lived in Chicago, you've seen an explosion in gun crime recently in Chicago. I mean, really horrific stuff. But not mass shootings like we're talking about here, but still, enormous numbers of people, 20 or more sometimes on a weekend getting shot. If I lived in an area like that, I've got to be honest with you, Kosher, I'd probably want a gun too. And isn't this the problem, that a lot of Americans do not trust other Americans, and therefore they want a gun as well?
That's right, and I actually went to business school in Chicago, so I lived there and know that well for a couple of years. And I think the other issue, though, with the root cause analysis is exactly that it is not a monolithic picture in the U.S. That's another thing to remember. We have a federated system, as you do in Australia, and in states like New York, like Maryland, like Rhode Island, the gun laws actually are quite restrictive, and it is more difficult to get them. And then in Texas and Florida and Arizona, it's more lenient. But the crime, if you overlay the crime data, it does not follow that. So Illinois has among the toughest gun restrictive laws in the nation, and the crime is among the worst, as you just pointed out. So that's sort of the other problem too, that it's more than just, I think, the access to weapons. There's other deeper issues in terms of who commits the crimes, how much prosecution is happening. There's a floundering maybe of law enforcement, and in many of these cases there were red flags where people were on the FBI's watch list, and still it was missed, and these shootings were allowed to take place. So there's somebody dropping the ball. There's a whole host of issues with it, and yes, I do think that as crime goes up, the tendency of Americans is going to be to amp up the firearm ownership rather than cut it down and just trust the police that are being defunded.
But Kosher, you look like a very nice law-abiding person. Did you have a gun when you lived in America?
I did not, but I have friends who do, and it doesn't. I don't get an emotional reaction to it if these are law-abiding people who train correctly and have it. It's not something that sort of gets a hair up on my back.
Now, Adam, Kosher mentioned there. I've just been reading the really excellent biography or memoirs of William Barr, who was Donald Trump's last Attorney General, who spoke of how it was that American cities, many ruled by the left, had dropped the ball on crime, on punishing people, on putting people in jail, on being proactive in policing, and had seen this explosion in crime. Donald Trump was getting on top of it, and then, of course, they were swept out of office. How do you explain the increase in shootings in just the past couple of years?
Well, look, I think it's certainly got something to do with the pandemic restrictions that came in during COVID. I mean, I don't think how anyone could conclude otherwise. There was obviously extraordinary social dislocation at the beginning of 2020, which was caused by all of the shutdowns, and you saw at exactly the same time a huge increase in homicides. And actually, by the way, you also saw a huge increase in car accident fatalities as well. So there was a lot going on there, and then it was sustained into 2020 when you had the ongoing restrictions. And then, thankfully, I think this year, 2022, you're seeing the rates of these fatalities and shootings fall off slightly, but they seem stubbornly high. So I think that is part of it. And I think it's also, as you alluded, I think in parts of the country, there's a go soft on crime attitude, especially in California. And parts of those major cities there in San Francisco and Los Angeles, for instance, are relatively lawless. And you're even having large shops like a Walgreens actually pull out and shut their stores down because they keep getting robbed all the time, and the authorities don't do much about it. So that obviously sends a message generally about crime. But look, there's a deeper, more profound issue too, I think, and that is kind of the social breakdown. I think that we're seeing kind of across the West in terms of single parent families and mental health. I mean, it's an awkward topic, but I mean, all of these shooters tend to come from broken homes, if you like. They are very depressed young men. And, as a society, I think we've got to ask why that happens. I don't know the answer to that, but it's worth pointing out that that's the case factually.
Coach Agata, Adam Creighton, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate it.